Hello, today we're going to look at the Battle of Malta. This place saw some epic fights, dating back to the 9th century wars between Byzantines and Arabs from Tunisia. Later we saw many others fighting here, Aragonese, Spanish, Ottoman, British, French or German, but in today's final table we have unexpected sides on the battlefield. Polish, Finnish and Hungarian players that seek for the first win on this island. Buy-in for this tournament was 600 euros, so we won't see top pros in the field, but to be honest I was surprised by the level of play on this final table. Of course, it wasn't all perfect, not everyone came to play, and you would expect someone with a name Attila would be fighting for more pots, but his strategy as the shortest stack was to catch a few pay jumps. This is the first hand not played by him. He open-folded a pair of 8s from the low jack, and this was his first mistake. This hand is just too good, even when he considers ICM. As the shortest stack, he shouldn't make any extreme adjustments from early positions and should raise around 16% of hands compared to around 20% with a chippy V scenario. Low pairs are a little bit awkward to play on this stack, so it might look like this is not that bad of a fold, because we see that solver folds most of the 6s and even some 7s. But this kind of mistake, where we cut the bottom of our range, is proportionally bigger the tighter we should play. Here we have 16% range, and when we cut bottom 2 combos everywhere, our range shrinks by half to just 8% of hands. If we do the same with a wider range, the mistake would be proportionally smaller. Another hand is another example, and it took place on the same orbit. Attila had ace-5 suited and folded, and we can see a very similar opening range as in a hand before, just a little bit more tight because of the earlier position. Solver always raises with ace-5 and folds some of the hands around it, so it again looks close. This is a leak that's the easiest to fix. There are very unique and complicated poker hands, but when it comes to studying, this is exactly where you should always start. Getting pre-flop raise first in spots right is just the easiest and the most efficient part of poker to study, because this situation comes around most often. The last hand with Attila starts with a raise from the massive chip leader in the middle position. He has a legitimate hand here, but we can see that he can raise very wide, with more than half of his hands. This is the power of the big stack in this ICM situation, as he can raise from this position 2 times more hands than in the chippy V scenario. Now action is on our Hungarian warrior, and he let go his ace-9 off. This is very bad. He is extremely short, and with a big blind ante, he will put almost most of his stack in the middle in the next orbit. Of course, he has 0 fold equity, but this is a great opportunity to almost triple up. Chip leader is very wide, and there is a very big chance that he will be heads up against him, because blinds would need very strong hand to get involved here, when they could get an immediate pay jump. He was way off with his decision, as every single ace was good enough to risk his tournament life. Next hand we see an American player completing the small blind with pocket 4s. He's in a tricky ICM situation with a few other stacks around 20 big blinds, so he wants to play smaller pot out of position. He should be very careful and fold almost half of his hands, and also calling is the most common action when we look at GTO ranges, but on around 20 big blinds he can also jam quite a lot, especially with offsuit aces and lower pairs. They're just perfect to go all in here. Low pairs are awkward to play out of position on this stack, and both calling and raising small with them can lead to a lot of bad scenarios, so jamming with them is the best option. Rasmus, who was second in chips, went all in with his queen 4 off, and this looks pretty wild, but it's actually solver approved. He should mostly check back or raise smaller, but there is also around 5% of range that wants to go all in here. It's few offsuit aces and some suited and offsuit trash, and queen 4 off is actually a hand from that group that wants to jam most often. Rob called, and I don't know what he wanted to achieve when he limped in the first place. This hand is much too weak to induce, and calling off for tournament life with almost 20 big blinds with a low pair is almost never a good play. Here he got lucky that he got jammed by a hand that was dominated, but don't be result oriented, and please don't do that at home. Next hand takes place with 4 players remaining and is also a battle of the blinds. The stack distribution is very interesting here, because 2 shortest stacks, one with less than 7 big blinds, already folded. Giovanni, who is second in chips, limped his ace-jack off against Adrian, who kept his massive chip lead for the whole final table. This is a very good play. Solver never raises in this scenario and folds more than half of the range. From an ICM perspective, this situation is awful for the second stack. His bubble factor here is around 2.5, and it's very high in this stage of the tournament. He should wait out the shortest stacks and do everything to not bust before them. Adrian raised with Jack 6 off, and this is fine play. We can see that he can go pretty wild and isolate this limp with around 2/3 of his range. There is one thing to keep in mind in his position. Giovanni isn't capped here as he limped with his whole range, and also a pretty strong one, so it's not like Adrian can punish him by raising with everything and barreling off on every board. The Italian player called, and this is also okay. In theory there is some limp raising and even limp jamming against a raise, but calling is the most common action, both by the whole range as with this specific hand. On the flop, Giovanni checked to the raiser, but in this specific situation he could donk bet quite a lot. This is a spot where he has a big equity advantage. He already folded all his trash, and also this board is pretty good for him. Adrian c-bet for half of the pot, and this is fine, but overall we can see that even with his positional advantage he shouldn't bet too often, because of how weak his range is compared to the player on the small blind. In this situation, the solver uses bigger sizes than usual, and half pot bet is fine, but he could bet even more. Giovanni called as he should with most of his range. He just doesn't have many hands that miss this board completely. On the turn, out of position player still has significant range advantage, and solver likes to donk bet with small sizing almost half of the time, so this was another opportunity to take away the initiative from player in position. Adrian bet for a little bit more than half of the pot. We can see that he should polarize more and bet mostly with bigger sizing. It also sets up the size of the pot a little bit better, so SPR on the river would be closer to 1. His specific hand is checking more than betting, but we can see that the solver likes to bet with hands like Jack 4 or Jack Deuce, and these are very similar in this situation. Italian player called again, and again this is a hand that he could use as a semi-bluff and raise some small portion of the time. On the river he checked, as he should with most of his range, and Adrian emptied the clip, overbetting with his Jack high. This is fine. Solver likes to go all in for value with all two pairs, and his bluffs usually has either a low pair that blocks a lot of two pairs from the opponent, and also some king and Jack high hands that block the nuts on this board. This is a nightmare scenario for the Italian. He hit one of his outs, but still isn't comfortable calling it off for tournament life. Solver shows that ace-jack off should always call here, but we have to keep in mind that this isn't a perfect solution, because our post-flop solver doesn't take ICM into account, and this is very important on this river. His bubble factor is huge here, so he needs much more equity than in GPV scenario to make this call profitable. Even here the solver folds some of the top pairs, so when we take ICM into account, this ace-jack starts to look worse and worse. If he calls and is right, he becomes a new chip leader. That's the best scenario. Fold keeps his comfortable second place, and calling and being wrong is a disaster, making 7 BB and 20 BB stacks jump in joy. He finally folded, and I think that this hand was played great by both players. It's easy to judge when we see the cards, but I don't think that folding here is too weak, and it's a very close spot that could go either way. Of course, it gets easier if we think that the opponent is unbalanced in any direction, but Adrian was playing very smart. He used his big stack very well and didn't mindlessly splash around, so making this call against a player that is very well balanced is very hard. Our last hand I want to show you today takes place during three-handed play. Adrian is keeping his massive chip lead with more than 120 big blinds, and both short players have only around 16 BBs. Giovanni limped his 9-8 suited from the small blind. This is a pretty hand and one that very often wants to see a flop, but in this scenario this is a mistake. He should be very selective with his hands and fold almost 60% of his range, but with the hands he wants to continue, solver just goes all in most often and is doing it with 9-8 suited with full frequency. We can see some other suited connectors sometimes limping, so it's not a big disaster. I added a few combos of 9-8 to his range so we can analyze this hand post-flop. Adrian checked back his Jack-9 off, and this is fine play. Solver overall checks back around half of his range and mixes raises between smaller ones and jams. Jack-9 off is either raising or checking. On this very dynamic board, Giovanni c-bet for 1 BB. He has a huge equity advantage and can bet here with almost his whole range, and also this is the most used sizing by the solver. Adrian called with his top pair, and this is completely fine, but it's worth to notice that this hand is pretty vulnerable and also strong enough to stack off against this very short stack, so raising here is also an option to consider. 9 of clubs is a very interesting card on the turn and makes this board even more coordinated. Giovanni checked, and this is an okay play. Overall he should polarize on this turn and either bet big or just check, and 9-8 prefers the latter. Polish player has 2 pairs now and value bet for 50% of the pot. Bet is fine here, but sizing wise it's a little bit too small. Solver either checks or uses bigger sizing. Giovanni found an aggressive line and decided to check raise his hand with very small sizing. I like his creativity. Solver never turns this specific hand into a bluff because it's good enough to call. It has both some showdown value and ability to improve. It's hard to fold out better hands, and if he gets action, he is usually way behind. Adrian called in position with his top 2 pairs, as he should with almost all of his range he wants to continue. On this low SPR there is not a lot of value in raising here because it shouldn't be a problem to get the stacks in on the river anyway, and that way he might keep some bluffs in small blinds range. After a brick on the river, Giovanni decided to go all in. This isn't the best situation to bluff too much, just based on the stack to pot ratio. He will give a very good price to Polish player, and based on action on the flop and turn, he is bluffing into a pretty strong range. We can see that the solver sometimes turns hands like pocket 8s into a bluff, but overall it mostly checks this type of hands, and his bluffs should come mostly from hands that have a queen or king blocker. Adrian called as he should with 2/3 of his range, and this was probably his easiest decision in this hand. After this elimination, he had around 90% of chips in play and closed the tournament pretty quickly. It wasn't a very flashy performance, maybe except that ballsy jack-6 off triple barrel bluff, but a great showing of how to navigate the final table as a chip leader. I hope you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and see you next time. Bye.